Well, hi, good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Welcome to Virtual Thursdays and sometimes Fridays, Dire Literary Series. And tonight, my guest is a fairly well known memoirist, mystery writer, crime writer, poet. You name it, he does it, and with a plethora of books, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So let me give you a little bit about. I went right to the books rather, and I need to, and I'm accepting cookies too. All right, it never fails to every week that I'm doing this. Here we go. Doug Crandell has worked for decades in employment and disability supports. He's an advocate for a sibling with disabilities. In 22 cents an hour, he focuses on how the disability industry complex is often impenetrable, mirrored in deficit thinking, and controlled by lobbying and trade groups. And here is Doug. Doug has published 8 books with publishers, including Penguin Random House, Chicago Review Press, Virgin Books, and Cornell University Press. The Great Sun magazine, and he has his MFA from Queen's University. And with that, I would love to turn this over to Mr. Doug Crandell.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I love the Sun magazine as well. So that's what I'm going to read from. Can I jump right into that, Timothy? Okay. And is it okay if I take my face off, or do you want it on? You
Rather
want
have
it
your
on?
face on, yeah. And I mean, you're not literally. I mean, don't strip it off, which would be really really cool. If that was the case, I'd say yes. But
All
keep your camera on. That'd be great.
right. Okay. All right. So this little piece I'm going to read from is from the Sun magazine, and last month's issue, and just Timothy and I were talking about how much we admire the magazine. I don't know how many folks know that last year was the 50th year of publication, which is hard to believe. And this essay called His Body of Work, again, was from last month's issue. And it was accompanied by Cy Safransky, the founder of The Sun, longtime editor, his very open letter about having a diagnosis of dementia. I love Cy very, very much. I love the magazine, and I guess I love the readers even more. And I was a little overwhelmed, to be honest, to have lots of people email about this essay. So it has a little intro, a quote by Harry Crews, and that's this quote. There is something beautiful about all scars of whatever nature. A scar always means the hurt is over. The wound is closed and healed, done with. I've written 20 years about my family, about almost 30 essays in the Sun, and this I decided would be the last one that I submitted to the Sun about my family. All of those are essay memoir pieces. So I will do other pieces for the magazine, but not about my folks. And so his body of work, you might guess, is thematic. I loved my father's body. It worried me too. At 8 years old, I marveled at the dark veins of his feet, like ridged worms under the pale skin, carrying his overworked blood as he plowed the fields at home and pulled double shifts at the ceiling tile factory. I'd cry when I saw his blistered soles, sulk if he suffered another scraped knuckle, another bruised forearm. I wanted to heal him. The little church our mother took us to in Terre Haute, Indiana, had a pastor with a malformed right arm who told the congregation that whatever physical ailments we endured in this life would be wiped away once we reached the promised land. I worried my father, who did not go to church, would spend the afterlife with all his scars, all his leg pains, all the aches in his lungs lodged there for eternity. As a small boy, he'd contracted polio, which had attacked his left leg. Our mother always told my siblings and me that when she'd first laid eyes on him in 6th grade, she'd known he was hers, even if he did limp. I didn't know what polio was, but it sounded scary, and he had survived it. This helped form my view of him as someone who could survive almost anything. Like Wile E. Coyote, he might get hurt and maimed, but he never, ever gave up. Dan Horace Crandell was born on a sleigh on Valentine's Day, 1939, in Clay County, Indiana. His parents had waited too long to make the trip to the doctor in town, so my father's first breaths were taken behind two mules. He was the baby of the family, having a brother 13 years older and a sister with more than a decade between them. The family sharecropped and raised beef cattle, specifically Angus, which my grandfather Crandell believed to be the most perfect breed: intelligent, loyal, resilient, and dignified. Holsteins and Herefords were brutes, he said, thick-skulled and obstinate, but his Angus were to be revered. The lovely cows, so refined in their excellent mothering, the bulls like onyx boulders of foot. My father's work life then began with performing chores in blizzards, using a sledgehammer to bust up the thick ice and frozen water troughs. 30 years later, he would demonstrate his technique to my brothers and me, sending shards of rime flying, showing us how to fish out the large hunks of ice to keep the animals' drinking water from going solid overnight. As always, he preached the consequences of not doing a job correctly, which could lead to injury or illness. Watch that your clothing doesn't get caught in the machinery. It will suck you in. Listen to your gut when herding steers. They can turn and trample you. Look out for groundhog holes in the fields. They'll break your leg. Though he wanted us to be cautious, he wasn't as mindful of his own safety. Once, he ripped open his hand while working underneath a greasy corn picker, attempting to loosen nuts from bolts so corroded they might have come from a shipwreck at the bottom of the ocean. Shortly after that, when I was 9, he suffered severe burns from an accident involving anhydrous ammonia, a chemical used to add nitrogen to the soil. It arrived in long, white tank shaped like pills, and we watched from the porch as a stranger showed Dad all the safety valves and hose connections. Though it reliably increased yields, our father was reluctant to use it, seeing it as cheating nature. When released from the tank, it would form a toxic gas. We had heard that a man over in Grant County had almost died from only 30 seconds of exposure. The rumor was it sucked the moisture out of you, like an invisible movie monster that fed on eyeballs and tongues. My father would later tell us how, at the feed store, one of the farmers had warned, "Watch it, Dan. That shit will eat you up and leave nothing but a dry husk." I think I'm going to stop there. That essay is the longest one I've ever published in the Sun. It's nearly about 7,500 words. All the other ones are about 3 or 3,500 words. But that's from his body of work. Thank you for letting me read.
Hi, Doug. How you doing? I see we have the same wardrobe designer, which is they get paid the big bucks to do us. So let me open with, so you found out about Psy, and I know that's really, it's hard to hear when someone you care about has that sort of diagnosis. But did that bring you kind of to like your own mortality, like when you heard about that?
That's a good question. I think more than anything, I sobbed. I've had the great pleasure of not only publishing the magazine. I started reading the Sun magazine when I was 14, and I didn't understand anything in it. But I love the poetry and the black and white photography and essays and fiction. And then as I started to learn about the history of the magazine, no advertising. Just the people that were launched in that magazine. And again, Tim, just the readers, meeting the readers. So the first time I got to do that was at Esalen. And Indiana's pretty landlocked, unless you get up to the Great Lakes. So first time I'd ever seen that part of the coast, and certainly felt somewhat out of place there, to be honest. Um, it's a long drive from milking cows and feeding pigs and all that, but uh, I met Cy there. I certainly had been publishing in the magazine. It was an honor to teach there, and then that's back when Sun was doing, up until about 2016 or 2017, Esalen retreats, Wild Acres in North Carolina, and then the Rowe Center in Massachusetts. And so I guess it moved from, to answer your question, it moved from, I mean, I'll just say it, kind of hero worship, right?
Yes.
To, I had a teenager at the time, and Cy gave me some advice that was so wonderful. And then I said this in the interview last month with the Sun, but I had tried to write about my family. You have to understand, the Sun magazine had written about them for 20 years. And so someone might think they're still alive. They've been gone 12 years. So I'd taken an earlier stab at an essay, and all Cy said was, too soon. And he was exactly right. So I'm devastated for him, and so proud of him to write such an open letter. And then, as some of you may know, there's always a signature interview each month. And of course, the interview is on dementia and research and kind of what we're not getting right in the United States around that. So,
Yeah, I don't think there'll be another magazine like the Sun. I don't think magazines like that can get launched this day and age and
I wouldn't
last
think
even
so.
3 years. I mean, the Sun is 50 years. So let's get back to what you
Yeah,
read
yeah,
here.
yeah.
You opened with a cruise quote. And
Mhm.
in terms of like writing craft and style, did that essay start with a quote and then you worked it, or did you have to find a quote that matched the essay afterward?
What a great question. Somebody who's done it, right? Now I cheated. I used all Harry Cruz quotes, and as you mentioned, I published a true crime book, which was difficult because I wanted it to mean something. I'd never read a true crime book before I wrote one, but I used his quotes in there, and I thought, just for this essay, that quote really seemed to stick out to me. I love Cruz. I certainly know there are some others who don't think that much about his legacy, but I thought as a craftsman, he was pretty difficult to beat. You know,
Now, your true crime book, are you talking about Fear Game?
Fear Came to Town. Yeah,
Yes.
it's these murders happened in 1997 in a place called Toombs County, Georgia. And there's a little town there called Santa Claus. There are three towns in the United States named Santa Claus, one in Georgia, one in Arizona, and one in Indiana. Um, so yeah, that, my literary friend said, you're writing what? You're going to be one of those guys? You're going to be one of those gory guys? But the story resonated with me. And this was before, it was 2009, before the huge push on true crime podcasts. So it
Now,
was
was this story featured in any true crime podcast that you'd heard, or?
no. I mean, it happened in 1997, and so what my first memory of it was just seeing it on CNN. I mean, it had that strange hook of Santa Claus, Georgia. People would come from all over the Southeast to get their mail stamped there, but Santa Claus, Georgia is really kind of a trailer park. It's not really a town, but it had its own little post office, a real U.S. post office.
Now,
Yeah.
yeah. So before this true crime, you wrote memoirs. Is it more difficult to not write about yourself and jumping into that genre, or was it easier?
Gosh, what a great question. I don't know about you all, but I don't find any writing easy. I have to spend a lot of time at it. Um, so I guess, to answer that question, the most difficult part in the true crime book was interviewing the surviving children. They were adults, but as somebody who loves being a dad, I wanted to get that right. and make sure I didn't hurt anyone or harm anyone. And it ended up being the most positive part of the whole experience. I was going to do another true crime book with Penguin, but I turned it down because it scared me too much. And I, again, did not want to be the guy who was ending up writing true crime all the time. So I did the one book and got out.
So earlier in 2004, 2007, you released memoirs, nearly back to back in terms of a writer's world. Was that meant to be one memoir that you cut in two, or did you have two separate ideas? You just decided to go with the second memoir.
No, they were two separate, ideas. 1976 is the first one, Pig Boy's Wicked Bird. It's this hand. That's what we call the wicked bird, because it was cut off, sewn back on in a farming accident, and I'd get made fun of. And so my brothers and friends would say, flip them the wicked bird. So I wrote about the summer of 1976 when that happened, and when Jimmy Carter was running for president, because I was obsessed as a little kid with Jimmy Carter. So I wanted, after that, Tim, I wanted to move forward to 1990 when I worked with my father. And that kind of, in a ceiling tile factory, that kind of set off all these essays in the Sun, to be quite honest. One little tidbit, I don't know how many people know Chicago Review Press. It's a great little middle kind of press. And I love doing those two books with them. They did them so well. But my agent sold it to Chicago Review Press because the Sun published my very first essay, which was called Wicked Birds. So then I went on to publish several of the pieces in the Sun magazine from the second memoir. Yeah.
Now you said Indiana's far away from factory and farm work. What about what you do now? How do you jump from a factory farm worker to being a strong, educated writer? Was that a difficult jump?
I guess I would disagree with those two. I'm not a strong writer. I'm not educated, but thank you. My dad, before he passed, would say, I want to see one of your paychecks. I don't believe you work at the University of Georgia. I don't think he believed it, but I'm so successful as a writer. I've had a day job and always will for the last 30 plus years. And the book that you pulled up, 22 cents an hour, is the book from 2022 with Cornell University Press. And that's my day job. I work around disability rights, labor rights, all those kinds of reform around disability care. So, it's important to me. And I guess I've taken two kind of mediocre incomes and tried to put them together.
Yeah, we're going to talk about your new book in a second, but DeWitt has a question in the chat, and it sounds to me, based on this question, this is something that you and DeWitt might have already talked about previously. What do you make of the body issues discussed in feminist criticism, my body, myself, etc.?
Yeah, that makes me uncomfortable even to try to address, I guess, what's interesting to me, to be completely honest, my family has disability, mental health, addiction, obviously farm injuries. Mine was not the only farm injury. One of my brothers had a traumatic brain injury, his head, like more than 150 stitches inside. My dad was an auctioneer for a little part of his life, so you'd see plenty of people who were missing limbs and fingers. And so I guess the way I'd answer that is, I think the body is in a lot of ways holy, but we have such a weird obsession in American culture with perfection and all that kind of strange stuff that it's difficult to talk about. I mean, if you want to get a group of men uncomfortable, DeWitt just asked the question, right? Because we're just not taught, not only not about how to talk about our feelings and all that kind of thing, but you're not supposed to talk about problems sexually or emotionally. I mean, that's just off limits in American culture. So that's what I'm drawn to in writing and reading, is seeing other people's experiences with that. And I think that's why I'm drawn to the Sun. It's always been so honest about those issues, and I just love it. So, DeWitt, I couldn't answer it, but I did my best.
So also your fiction, you have the Body Knows No Pain trilogy. Does that address some of that what you just spoke of?
Yeah, that was interesting. It was a 2007, 2008. It was Virgin Books, and that's you guys remember what happened then, right? The subprime mortgage crisis. There was supposed to be a third one that never got published because Virgin Books was shuttered in 2008. But yeah, Tim, that's true. I mean, The Flawless Skin of Ugly People, the first one in that trilogy was, about a couple that were not perfect. And then Hairdos of the Mildly Depressed, which was the second one, was about a traumatic brain injury with two brothers. Oh, and it also has a lot of disability and mental health in it. So I'm drawn to that kind of writing that's real honest. Um, some people call those crisis memoirs or whatever. If they're well done, it's a story that resonates with all of us because all of our families. One of my favorite titles of all time of a novel is Douglas Copeland's All Families Are Psychotic.
What a
Because
great title.
as soon as you see that title, you have kinship with him, right? You know this person is going to write about what it really means to be in a family and all of its perfections.
So, almost, Lord, everything's connecting really nicely because my next question is there's this famous quote that everyone has a story to tell, but not everyone can write it, sometimes not even the author. So,
It's good.
is that something that you agree with, or
Yeah, I do. I guess I would agree with that. I mean, I talked about this last month, but my dad was not happy with any of the books other than the true crime book. I mean, a factory farm worker is not going to read Hairdos and Mildly Depressed. It's just not going to, even if it's his son. So I think that just gets back to also Tim, the kind of the masculinity, the fake masculinity that we have. Some of the generations that felt like, you know, you weren't a man if you talked about those kind of things. Uh, but my dad did say about the All American Industrial Motel, which he's kind of the centerpiece. I mean, it's about my addiction, his affairs, all that imperfection in our family. And the only thing he said to me was, if you were not my son, I'd drop you like a wet bag of cement. And that was it. So, to his credit, I would always send stuff to them. My mom would sometimes send things back with big red marks through them. And I would say, if it's inaccurate, you can do that. If you just don't like it, you can't. So I think there's a balancing act with all of that. And, I've always kept it open on the memoir side that you have every right to be mad at me. And I'd love to talk about it.
so your new book, your newest
Yeah.
book, 22 cents per hour, disability rights and the fight to end sub-minimum wage. Why is it that people feel it's okay to do that and also do the whole like time management? Like this person works at 10% speed, so we'll pay him 10% of the minimum
Yeah.
wage. Like
How do you know
why is
that?
that okay?
I got to
Oh,
ask you, how do you know that?
oh, I've done a lot of research in my job as well.
Yeah, it's a weird, without boring people to death. It comes from the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was 1938. People forget that prior to 1938, we had children in coal mines, no overtime, no right to unionize, all those things. And so it's an artifact that's left over. But I use the term the disability industrial complex. I was shocked to find out that some of the biggest names, I could say them and you would know what they were just by simply going to a thrift store, were one of the biggest lobbyists against phasing out subminimum wages. And 22 cents, that title comes from a Freedom of Information request where they found that some goodwill entities were paying workers with disabilities 22 cents an hour.
But isn't there also, all right,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna play the devil's advocate because
Yeah,
I'm sure
yeah,
you've heard this argument too. So if people get paid a fair wage if they're disabled, won't they lose some of their benefits? So they
yeah.
might lose their Social Security, they might lose their health insurance. So is it really all that bad to pay someone less than the minimum wage?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's a myth, right? You can keep Medicaid even if you have a $0 cash check each month. So, in other words, you go to work in a real job in the community, you're making minimum wage, your SSI check goes down to maybe $10, you can still keep Medicaid. It's called Part A and Part B. So there's a lot of myth there. Now, 12 states have formally banned or phased out, have plans to phase out subminimum wages, but the bill is still stuck in Congress for the entire United States and will probably stay there because these human service agencies keep lobbying against phasing it out, and that tells you something, right? There's got to be somebody's got to be making money if they don't want it to go away.
So myth or reality? If everyone's up to minimum wage, disabled people just won't be hired.
That's another myth. You're right. I got to find out how you know all this. Yeah, that is another myth too. Of course, just like mental health and addiction, disability is the natural part of being a human being. So the HR director at a small company likely has an aunt, a brother, somebody, maybe somebody who has Down syndrome, autism, bipolar. And so I haven't found that in the 30 plus years I've been doing it. It's actually the opposite, that when I start to, and I do a lot of this, when I start to talk to small companies or large companies, they get excited about truly being diverse and helping somebody. I mean, seeing somebody bring home a check that's not $8 for 40 hours and it's 500 is pretty thrilling to watch, and maybe the only way I get into heaven. Probably the only way I get there.
So in this day and age, nearly everyone has a diagnosis. Anyone that's in therapy automatically gets a diagnosis. I know a lot of new diagnoses, people with ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, because the spectrum is really, really wide. Everyone always says, I have attention deficit disorder. So how do you think society would act if companies walked around like my office, for example, and said, you only work because of your disability, you only get paid half time, you only get paid 25% less? Do you think that would fly ever?
You're right. No, I don't know if you guys remember Harry Smith from NBC's, what was that called, Rock Center or something like that. He did a whole show on this in 2011 called The Wage Wars, and there's a great guy who headed up the national autism kind of advocacy work, and this guy says to Harry Smith, well, Harry, how would you do if someone was standing outside your office with a stopwatch? How much would you be paid? And it kind of made Harry, the reporter, laugh. So it's standards that we wouldn't apply to people without disabilities, but somehow it's fine to do that. We have in the United States, and I'll be quiet here, but we have a medical model instead of a social model of disability. And unfortunately, that medical model, which isn't a good one anyway, is embedded in hyper-capitalism. So you have this disability industrial complex that literally gets hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And that's a tough one in the United States to dismantle. I think that's why the bill is just sitting there and has been sitting there for 3 years to phase it out nationally.
So, would you say that the advocacy for the disabled in this regard is as strong or less so than the advocacy for paying full wages for those that are incarcerated or those overseas in the quote, I guess the modern day sweatshops now?
Yeah. Well, that's funny. That was the original title, America's Hidden Sweatshops, because I think most people believe it's all benevolent. They see, I'll just give you a name from a state, Open Arms Sheltered Workshop. You hear Open Arms and you see folks who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. You're not gonna think they're doing something nefarious. So I think we've kind of fooled just the American public to not look too deeply into this disability industrial complex. But when you just start to kind of peel a little away, it's not benevolence. It's not all good deeds. That's not to say, I've worked in disability for 30 years, so I'm part of the problem. I admit that clearly. But the advocacy part, I think one of the big pieces that's difficult is someone's always speaking for a person with an intellectual disability. And so it gets very much diluted in terms of advocacy. Yeah.
Yeah, like agency names. The one I always hear is any agency that's pathways to something, they'll never get there. The path never goes there.
That's right. That's right. There was a provider here in Georgia that renamed this Awful Day program that had sewage backups and I mean, it was just this dilapidated building. I'm not kidding you. They were trying to rename it, and these human service professionals, I was sitting at the table, came up with this name, the Paradise Club. And I started laughing so hard, offended them. The one and only time I got written up in HR when I worked at that organization, because I offended the professionals. But you get what I'm saying here. It's a great kind of snippet of what we think in our American culture. I mean, no one would ever say, "Oh, this is paradise. This is fantastic."
Change the name, but don't change the name, but don't change the ideology.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So in this latest book that we're just talking about, and I'm gonna close with it with this question: does your book offer solutions, advocacies, wish lists? Like, what is the end product that you hope that this book will reach, and what will it lead to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, because it's easy, right, to bitch and moan, and I do a lot of that. There are solutions. That bill is one of them. As long as that's the law of the land, it doesn't matter that 12 other states have outlawed it, because we're just going to keep living down to these low expectations. I always think about young parents and what they see for their child, and that moves me. But the solution is first to phase it out. It's been here for 84 years. The second part is to get serious about disability policy at the federal level. Incentives to employers, real inclusive apprenticeships. I don't know, Tim, you probably know this because you know so much about this topic, but now we have 260 programs in the United States now for inclusive post-secondary. There are folks who were considered 35 years ago, I'm going to put quotes here, mentally retarded, who that same demographic are now going to college. So it's all about how we view that stuff. And we're so far behind as an industrialized country. The UK has done a beautiful job of really basing all their services in that social model. So the other answer then too, of course, is how do you get rid of some of these myths and stereotypes that you were mentioning before? Because that holds us back.
All right. I would like to thank Doug Crandell for reading his essay and talking about many of his books. This was the new one is right there. And this is a must read, and it's a must read for everybody, regardless of what political party that you sit at. I think it's definitely
Yes.
it's a good talking point, and check it out. And there's the two memoirs that we talked about are up here, and some of the trilogy is there, and definitely like check out Doug's books. You can find them at bookshop.org or your favorite indie or Amazon if you must. Thank you
Thank,
again.
thank
Thanks,
you
Doug.
very, thank you very much. Had a blast. Yeah.
And folks that are watching on the live stream on Facebook, if you've got something to read for the open mic, come on in. I'll let you in. Use that Zoom link. And if not, thank you for watching. Our next one is going to be a week from Thursday, as I go every other week. And as always, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can see all of the interviews. So thanks again. And Doug, thank you once more.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks, everybody. I love you, DeWitt.